All right, so here we go. We're going to start it off. Trauma behaviors in the service of survival. So here's what we know in the clinical literature. The clinical literature lets us know that if you are in a school setting, if you're in a classroom and you're seeing behaviors from students that you don't appreciate, students that you're not happy with, student behavior that you're not okay with, when you're seeing that, here's what the literature says, that approximately 9 times out of 10, those are behaviors that are in the service of survival. Right? In the service of survival. So that doesn't mean our normal acting up behavior. I'm talking about severe behavior, the behavior we are really not okay with, the behavior that we want to reject and want to stop and want to repel or whatnot. 9 times out of 10, those are behaviors that are a residual leftover effect from some type of trauma. And so that child is acting and behaving in that way, really in the service of survival. Their nervous system has not yet identified that being in class with you is consistently safe. Being in class with you is consistently secure. Being in class with you has consistently not resulted in them being violated or harmed in any way. So their nervous system and their brain have not registered that piece. And so when that doesn't happen, you get a lot of these behaviors that are really unappreciated. What I would like to kind of give a shout out to is that remember that when we see behaviors we're not appreciative of, when we see behaviors that we don't like and we want them to stop, the human tendency, the typical nature of all humans is to reject and to react. And so what we have is an entire school profession that has learned to turn off that biological mechanism, right? So teachers, when they're seeing behaviors they don't like, if this is a class right here and I've got some student that's really acting up, doing some atrocious behaviors that I'm not appreciative of, it is a biological mechanism in me, the teacher, for me to want to survive. And so one way to do that is to reject and to push away and to really react so I can get this behavior to stop for my own survival. And so we have this entire profession where teachers have learned to override that biological mechanism. They've learned to override all of these typical ways of rejecting and repelling and to really kind of step in and figure out, hey, what's going on? Hey, what's happening here, right? And so we want to start with just by acknowledging the beauty of overriding your own biological mechanism for survival so that you don't repel, you don't reject, you don't deject, you don't shut down these students. And most teachers don't. Most teachers override that mechanism and they step into the situation. They step into little Mark. They step into little Rachel. Hey, what's going on, right? What we know through the research is that teachers are at home trying to figure out, how can I connect with Mark? How can I connect with Rachel? How can I make their school and academic experience different? And so if you could kind of picture those behaviors as a fire, most of us, it's neurotypical for most of us to want to shut that fire down and get away from it. But here you have teachers who are stepping into the fire on a daily basis. Granted, that leaves its own wounding and sometimes a mass exodus from the teaching profession, but we still have to recognize an entire scope of practice is dedicated to stepping into the fire and really working with these children. So that's beautiful. What we do want to do is figure out like what exactly is happening, how do I understand these situations, how do I understand these behaviors and whatnot. So we're going to take just a brief look at what is neurotypical for a child or for a human species in general, right? So we were all built with this blueprint, the nervous system connecting to the brain, making sense out of the world, certain neurotransmitters being released that propel us to feel certain things and whatnot. So neurotypically, what I'm looking at right now is a child that has not experienced any trauma at all. Any trauma, that's neurotypical. And so a neurotypical brain, one with no historical trauma, has been created to respond to this. Respond to this type of look. Respond to this type of pleasantry. Respond to an authoritarian figure. Respond to a mentor, a supervisor, a teacher, where they are smiling and they are welcoming this student. Students that are neurotypical will feed into that. They're going to see that praise coming from that teacher. They're going to see that look of involvement. The bottom picture, this teacher is really involved. This teacher is pointing out like, yeah, tell me more. What do you have to say? So neurotypically, we are built to feed off of that. And we will actually go around and search for times and experiences where people are pleased to see us, where they are smiling, where they are welcoming, where they are engaging, where they are bringing us in, where they are hearing us, and whatnot. And there becomes this beautiful reciprocity in classrooms. And so from a neurotypical perspective, just know that most children become addicted to this. The addiction process is interrupted when something has gone horribly awry. But our original blueprint was created in this way, where those that had authority and power, when we saw that they were pleased with us, we would step in a little bit more. We saw they were pleased and praising us, we would step in a little bit more. We would listen to what are they pleased with us about, and we would do more of that behavior. That's how our blueprint was created. We can actually identify neurotransmitters that are released when someone looks right at us and smiles and says, "I'm so glad you're here," or "Welcome here." So we create this just as a human species. So this is the neurotypical process. We're built this way. We seek it out in lots of different ways. We need it. So even as adults, we usually will gravitate towards colleagues and supervisors that are often telling us the same thing, such as, "Hey, I really like how you handled that IEP. Despite the fact that it was 8 hours long, you did really well in it." Or, "Hey, great job on that 504. I like how you wrote that up. I really like how you engaged with the second grade teacher." So when we are getting this type of feedback, it releases neurotransmitters that make us want to get more of that, because that's how the human species was created. We seek it out. So for supervisors in the room, there's so much research out there that says that when people leave a workplace, they're not leaving a workplace because they don't like the work, right? The majority of the time they're leaving a workplace because they don't feel nurtured or nourished. So the literature went in to try to do a little bit more research and figure out exactly what was going on with that. They leave when they're not getting a release of these feel-good chemicals, these feel-good neurotransmitters, right? And so they exit a workplace. So we want to be able to figure out how we can acknowledge and how we can reach out and offer up praise, offer up gestures, even just welcoming looks. The same thing is playing out in our classrooms. Teachers that are able to offer up an activator so that those neurotransmitters can be released, usually have students in their class that can tolerate upsets that have happened, can tolerate some type of upset that has happened during the academic day, during the classroom setting, and they can quickly turn around and figure out how to correct that and how to fix that. And so in general, what we know is that from a neurotypical perspective, we seek a release of neurotransmitters daily. We are seeking that, we are needing that, and it all has an effect. And here are the neurotransmitters specifically that I'm talking about. So you have your serotonin, your dopamine, and your oxytocin. Now, keep in mind that these neurotransmitters, these chemicals that get released in the body, they have a number of tasks. All of them have a number of tasks. What we're talking about today is the relational field. So I'll be talking about the task as it relates to how we connect with others. So for instance, what I mean by that is serotonin is also responsible for libido, is responsible for hunger and satiation, whatnot. But how we're talking today is we're going to talk about how it relates to relational engagement and connection. So a neurotypical individual, a brain that has not been traumatized in any way or any capacity, a neurotypical brain, is going to release serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin when someone in their vicinity is telling them, "Good job, well done, I like how you did this." All of a sudden, you're going to get a release of these three drugs. In the clinical literature, we call this the love-drug combo, right? So this is the love-drug combo. So we get a burst of all of these. And it helps us understand them when we look at what's the cognitive calling card that's left behind. Every neurotransmitter, every chemical, like I said, has a number of tasks that are related to it, but it also can leave behind a cognitive calling card. Because as a species, remember, we're human, we are meaning-making creatures. People have heard that phrase before. We're meaning-making creatures. So an experience can happen. We're going to extrapolate from that experience and create meaning. And so that's where your cognitive calling card comes from. So here's the cognitive calling card left behind by each of these. When serotonin hits the system and it is appropriately delivered in the system, enough serotonin leaves you behind this calling card. If today was no good, tomorrow might be better. If this week was no good, next week might be better. If this month was awful, next month might be better. And so with enough serotonin priming as it was intended, priming through the system, it leaves a sense of hope and optimism. Hope and optimism. And some of you can understand that maybe from a personal experience or a loved one in your life where we know that there might be a serotonin issue, a serotonin challenge for them, and so we can see more depressive features. And so when we don't have this calling card on the scene, here's what is left behind. Today was awful, so tomorrow will be awful. This month was awful, well, next month's going to be even worse or just as awful. So when we don't have enough serotonin, we are missing the cognitive calling card of hope and optimism. Does that make sense, that serotonin piece? Okay, so we have that piece. What we know is that when we come around people that praise us and let us know, well done, I really like how you did this, I like how you did that, we get a little burst. That's our first burst of serotonin, leaving some hope and optimism. Our second neurotransmitter, our next transmitter is dopamine. And dopamine has a number of tasks related as well, but due to the relational content of today, we're going to talk about how it leaves behind this element of happiness. So when enough dopamine is surging through the system, right, whatever we are partaking in that we like, right, like I've been eating a piece of chocolate cake and I really like it, what's going to happen is that dopamine is going to hit the system, and that dopamine is going to tell me I want more, and I'm going to figure out how to have more, right? So happiness and motivation are tied to the dopamine pleasure pathway. Realize that the underbelly of dopamine, the darker piece of dopamine, is that it's related to every element of addiction, rather it be substances of addiction, behavioral addiction, whatnot. So that's the underbelly, and we'll talk more about that in a moment. But just if it's appropriately surging through the system, if enough has been released as we were originally intended, our blueprint was originally intended, then we would start to feel this dopamine release when we are engaging in certain things. By the way, just in the human species in general, dopamine is directly tied to food and sex, and that was to ensure the survival of the species, right? We need to take in food so that we are strong and can continue to take care of things that we need to do and whatnot, and then for sex so we can have procreation for the species, which is why when we partake in food and sex, we get a huge dopamine release, which lets us know, hey, I want more of that. That felt really good, and I want more of that. But the same also happens with relational exchanges. And so, for instance, you know, if you're a teacher or you have a teacher at your school site and the teacher looks at a child and says, hey, I really like how you helped pick up all the equipment after recess. Thank you so much. I really appreciate that. If that child is neurotypical, meaning there has been no violations, there's been no trauma on board, if that child is neurotypical, what will happen is they'll get a dopamine release. And that dopamine release sends them a message, I like this. This is nurturing and nourishing. I'm appreciative of this exchange. So enough dopamine then will affect motivation. And now the child will be motivated to, hey, if you thought I picked up everything really good today, you wait till tomorrow. And so it's this motivation to step into what releases the dopamine, step into what releases that dopamine and sends them a message that this feels good, this sounds good, this experience is awesome, and they're going to want more of it. And so when they get these kind of praise looks and welcoming looks and whatnot, it releases and it has that exchange. There's a reason why that doesn't happen in traumatized individuals. We will go in depth about that, but I'll just give you a little teaser right now. When the dopamine is released in a child that has been traumatized, the sense of distrust trumps it, right? And so that's why you as a teacher or admin, you might have to give praise to Johnny 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, because distrust will trump the feeling that dopamine leaves behind. Because the distrust is this: I see you praising me, but I don't know when you're going to harm me. I see you praising me and you're pleased with what I do, but I don't know how you're going to violate me. Because that arcs back all the way to the original trauma. And so distrust trumps the dopamine effects that are released. And so that's why with traumatized individuals, they're not always believing or accepting your, hey, well done. As a matter of fact, they're very much skeptical. And so that's just a little bit about your dopamine. Then the very last one, our oxytocin. Oxytocin, again, is responsible for a number of tasks, but due to today's topic, we're going to talk about relational. So when oxytocin is released in the body, the cognitive calling card that it leaves behind is related to lovability. The belief that I'm lovable, that I can give love and I can receive love. So oxytocin, and again, a number of tasks, but for relational components, it's this lovability piece. So for a neurotypical child, when you have enough of this surging through, they believe that they are lovable even in the midst of mistakes. Even in the midst of mistakes, they still believe they can give love and can receive love. And so that's the beauty of oxytocin. And just to kind of put things in perspective regarding different populations, the population that has the lowest measurable rate of oxytocin is your foster children. The lowest rate of, the lowest rate of oxytocin. Can you imagine how difficult it is to maneuver and navigate through life, not knowing if you're lovable, you can give love and you can receive love, right? That would create lots of stutter steps. And there's a body of research on that, those particular stutter steps. And here's what has been found out. In a neurotypical child, one that does not have any trauma, right? No trauma on board, what we know is that they take healthy risks. They take more healthy relational risks than a child that has been traumatized, because they have the serotonin, the dopamine, and the oxytocin surging through. And so what it creates is this mixture of awareness that I'm lovable even in my mistakes, that I have enough motivation to move forward, and that I have some sense of hope and optimism. And so what that allows is a student to traverse through school much differently. So it looks something like this. If I'm a neurotypical child, no historical trauma, and I have enough of these chemicals surging through my body as was intended in my original blueprint, right? And so I'm walking through school and I see a group of kids and they're all playing instruments. They're all in, jazz or whatnot. I think to myself, I want to play one of those instruments. I want to learn how to do that. If I have enough oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine surging through my system, I will step to it and I'll ask, hey, how do I get into this club? I'll maybe reach out and find the teacher. Hey, how do I talk to this teacher? So I'll reach out and I'll find some type of connection. If I have enough of these chemicals, I will take a healthy relational risk and move forward. As I go through school, I see some kids playing basketball and I think to myself, hey, I'd like to play basketball. I've never played basketball before, and I'll step into it. I'll step into, hey, how do I meet the coach? How do I talk to some kids on the team? How do I sit on the bleachers and watch and figure out how to jump in there? So I'll take healthy relational risks. If I come into math class, let's say I walk into math class and I realize I don't even know what the homework was last night, I missed it. I'm gonna walk up to some students. I have enough oxytocin, serotonin, and dopamine surging through my system. I'll walk up to students and I'll ask for help. I'll walk up to students and I'll say, hey, what was the math assignment last night? It fell off my radar, I forgot it, whatnot. Is it out of the book or is it on our Chromebook? Help me out a little bit. So that asking for input, asking for help is easy when you have enough serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin surging through the system. If I walk into the cafeteria and there's a couple kids sitting at the cafeteria and I think to myself, oh, I'd like to meet them, I want to sit with them. If I've got these neurotransmitters appropriately surging enough in them that the brain is picking up on them and my nervous system is calm to experience them, then I'm going to walk up to those and, hey, can I grab a seat here? Right? That healthy relational risk. Now let's look at someone that has been violated, traumatized, or harmed. And we don't have enough of this. I'll tell you what dissipates that in just a moment. But what we don't have is enough serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin. They have the same experience of recognizing what they want, because it does not eradicate what you want. It eradicates your healthy risk-taking to acquire it. So once again, the absence of these chemicals do not get rid of what you want or desire. It simply impairs your ability to step into it and to take a healthy risk in acquiring it. So let's say traumatized history, right? And I walk up and I see students playing their instruments, right? Jazz club, choir club, whatever it is. And I'm like, hey, I really want to do that too. That'd be really cool. You know what? No, I'm just going to stand back. I'm just going to watch it. I'm just going to see how it all unfolds. And, I'd probably be no good anyway, whatnot. And so then I let that experience go by. And I'm walking through the school, and then I see the basketball players again. I want and desire to be a part of that, but I don't have enough oxytocin, dopamine, serotonin to help me have a relational risk. And so I don't step in to ask, what you guys do to be on the team? Can I be the clock keeper for a while to watch the team? I don't have enough healthy relational neurotransmitters helping me with that. So instead, I still identify, I want it and I desire it, but now I'm gonna go into a dark narrative, how it's not for me, and I probably wouldn't be any good anyway, and you probably gotta get really awesome grades to be there. No, I'm just gonna step back. And so on and so forth. Same for the math class. I walk into the math class, I know I forgot my homework, I wasn't even sure what it was. I still have the desire and the want to be an okay math student, but I do not have enough of these love-drug combo rushing through my body that would help me take that healthy relational risk and say, hey, can you guys help me out? What was on the homework? So that's what I'm missing. And then same for the cafeteria. As a matter of fact, if I were walking to the cafeteria and I see some people eating there, I don't have these surging through my body, and so now I'm gonna go ahead and find some quieter place, or I'm gonna find a place where there are people at the table, but it's very clear that they're not necessarily wanting to engage. I'll pick that table because now I know I don't have to relationally engage, right? So what we can see is that serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin leave behind these cognitive calling cards, right? So it goes through the system first, and then we are meaning-making species, and that's where our cognitions often come from. So we kind of have to ask ourselves, hey, if as a human species, we were created to have this surge through our body so we can take relational risks, so we can ask for help, so we can seek out people being pleased with us, then we got to figure out what interrupts that. So the interruption of those three chemicals is either done by trauma or by toxic stress. Remember, they're all on a continuum, right? Toxic stress and then trauma. Trauma is usually hands-on direct trauma in the clinical literature. That's how we look at it. But just so you are aware, the clinical definition of trauma is anything outside the range of usual human experience that evokes terror, fear, and a sense of hopelessness. That's the clinical definition of trauma. And by the way, the reason why that piece is so important is because right now we're running into an issue with society overusing the word triggered, right? They'll use it all the time, right? So you drive through Starbucks and they don't have your favorite, frappuccino, and you're like, oh my God, I'm so triggered. No, you're not. You're just pissed. They don't have your drink. Like there's a difference, right? So when we say triggered, remember, here's how it will bounce you out of that. In order to be truly triggered, it had to take you back to the time and space in which you felt terror, fear, and a sense of hopelessness that was outside the range of usual human experience. That's trigger. Trigger has to be related to the trauma. And so it's not that you're being triggered, it's simply that you're being activated or you're being put out, whatnot. So we've got to be careful. The word trigger is being overused and it can really cause a lot of damage. So we want to pull back on that a little bit. But what interrupts these three healthy neurochemical releases of serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin is either trauma or toxic stress. So this is my only slide that is a pre-COVID slide, and I leave it up here for a reason, for this stat below. According to the research from Center for Disease Control, 6 out of 10 children experience trauma. 6 out of 10. That was pre-shutdown. What we now know is that these numbers, we're going to have a huge mark in our historical record where we have an uptick, and that's because the shutdown was a form of toxic stress, which is on the same continuum as trauma. And so these numbers, 6 out of 10, are actually pre-COVID. I want to make that very clear. What we know is that going through the shutdown is an ACE score. It gave everyone an additional ACE score. And due to the research, because why? It was outside the range of usual human experience, and for some of us, it evoked terror, fear, panic, and again, really leaving us with, some of us, a sense of hopelessness. When will this end, right? Especially if we thought it was gonna end after the 4-week shutdown. And then we're like, no, it's gonna run for another month, right? And so what that did was keep activating a sense of hopelessness. And so that's why for some, the shutdown became toxic stress, went on to the continuum, and for some was very traumatic, very traumatic. So here we have a little cheat sheet. This little cheat sheet just helps us put things in perspective. So positive stress, remember everything's on the continuum. We've got our positive stress here. We're going to come on down to our tolerable stress, right? Our toxic stress, and then very much our traumatic experiences. So trauma and toxic stress, they're siblings, right? Very closely related. The way that we differentiate it is that many times trauma is with hands-on experience, being traumatized and hurt from an individual. And so that's sometimes how we tease that out. Not to say that other things cannot be traumatizing, a fire in which the whole town was taken out, things like that. But what we're talking about in the clinical literature is usually the harm done by one to another. All right, so if we look at this little cheat sheet, we've got our positive stress all on one end of the continuum, which are brief increases in the heart rate with just a little bit of those elevations of your stress hormones, right? Your stress hormones being cortisol and adrenaline. So we just got a little bit of rise from those chemicals. Then down here, if we move on the continuum to tolerable, serious temporary stress responses, meaning the faucet of the adrenaline and cortisol, those are your stress hormones, the faucet was turned on for a little bit longer. Right? So up in positive, we got a burst, got turned on, got turned off. But here we go, tolerable, we've got a little bit more coming on, a little bit more of that cortisol and adrenaline coming out. However, buffered by supportive relationships. So if you had supportive relationships, it helped buffer the drippage of cortisol and adrenaline that was in your system. Many times the supportive relations helped prime the serotonin, dopamine, and oxytocin release. And so those supportive relationships were able to come back and kind of combat some of this cortisol and adrenaline. And then here we go, further on the continuum, your toxic, prolonged activation of the stress response system. By the way, that was the shutdown. That meets the perfect prolonged activation of the stress response system. And so what that means is this faucet of cortisol and adrenaline was turned on for a longer amount of time, prolonged dripping, prolonged flooding of your cortisol and adrenaline. But here's how you get the real stamp for toxic stress. This is the stamp that changes everything. In the absence of protective relationships, which is why some during COVID stayed here in this tolerable piece. But what we know with the literature, we had quite a few here. This is where we saw families crumbling. We had the highest separation rate than we've ever seen in the historical makeup of us. We had a huge separation rate. Remember, some of you might remember all of a sudden they were talking about real estate. Real estate was going up during COVID. Do you kind of remember that, right? And looking for places might have been really difficult and things were selling and people were trying to figure out why was that happening? That was happening because during COVID we had so many split families. Did not file for divorce, but separated. And so separated during COVID. That's why. So the reason real estate went up, because in the beginning, we were kind of like, wow, look at all these people being able to work from their home. And look at all these people possibly entertaining moving, right? So from original glance in the real estate uptick during COVID, we thought it was a positive. But then upon deeper analysis, what was found out, oh, snap, this has nothing to do with working from home. This has to do with the amount of separations that we've had here in North America, right? And so what that meant is that you had lots of families that weren't able to stay in this tolerable piece. Right? The serious temporary stress relief, cortisol, adrenaline being released due to the shutdown, but a lot of buffered supportive relationships. Instead, we had many families that were down here in toxic, where a lot of ugliness did come out in their families, a lot of strain on the relationships, a lot of losses in the relationships, and no protective relationships. Here's interesting enough. What we found in that toxic bundle is that some students came from a home where they had already been aware there were no protective relationships in the home. The protective relationships that help buffer and make the kids survive on an everyday basis, they were where? School. They were definitely at school, which is why you can have 10 traumatized kids right here. If I line up 10 traumatized kids pre-COVID, 10 traumatized kids. The reason why they don't have so many toxic traits and behaviors from their trauma that was going on at home is because they would step in consistently and with teachers and get what we call neural replacement activities. Teachers are responsible for neural replacement activities. That means the consistency of knowing that you are protected and safe and secure here, the consistency of knowing that someone's going to check in with you, the consistency of knowing that someone's going to ask how you're doing, the consistency of knowing what happens at school, right? I don't get hit here, I don't get hurt here, I don't get violated here. And so you were the protective piece. And so with the shutdown, that protective piece was removed, which is why we had a higher number of toxic stress cases than we had expected. You know, just on a side note from a social worker perspective, a lot of people are unaware of this, but in some of our rural settings, our very rural settings, North Dakota, South Dakota, you know, we had to have specialty departments set up in the social work department. Those specialty departments were to look for kids that we did not believe were alive, where their lives were taken during COVID. The only reason why those kids were alive pre-COVID is because they had to show up at school every day, or else you would report something. And when they did show up to school, you would recognize differences. You would recognize how they were acting. You would make reports. When that went away, we actually had to have 2 social workers in some of these rural departments partner together. They were not looking for live kids. They were looking for dead kids. And unfortunately, we found some of them, right? And those made it to the paper. So just kind of keep in mind, at no time in history have we had to do that. We went through a huge petri dish experience, and the experience says kids are safer when schools are open, right? Kids are safe, so we can never deny that ever again. We can never deny that ever again. So just realize the reason why some families pre-COVID didn't slip into toxic stress is because you were part of their lives. You kept them in the tolerable stress. They came to you, they got nurtured and nourished, they went home and had violations, came back, right? And so now they're stuck in this conundrum, right? Like what's going on? Which, by the way, the research also says why some students have been traumatized. You know who they look for a future partner when they're out in the world and they're looking for an intimate romantic partner in the future? Many times they find someone that is much like their 4th grade, 5th grade teacher. Oh, that's crazy when you read about it, right? Think about it. They're looking for character traits and whatnot. And so just realize teachers are responsible for neural replacement activities at a higher rate than many of us psychotherapists. You do neural replacement activities every day because you're so consistent with all kinds of things. When you say there's going to be a test on Friday, there's going to be a test on Friday. When you say tomorrow we're going to talk about dinosaurs, tomorrow you're going to talk about dinosaurs. That consistency activates dopamine, serotonin, and oxytocin. That consistency allows for the individual to grow, right? And that's different than what they were at home with. There wasn't consistency, because we know in abusive homes, you can have a parent look right at you and say, I love you on Monday, and beat you within an inch of your life on Tuesday. So see the difference? But yet at school, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, you said what you said and you stuck to it. And we have a lunch every day at 11:20. And we have recess every day at this time. And when I fail, you pull me off to the desk and you talk to me when I have an F grade. And when I have an A grade, you look at me and you shoot me oxytocin, dopamine, and oxytocin from across the room. Right? Consistently, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. That kept it out of toxic stress and kept it up here and tolerable if they had abusive homes. And so during the shutdown, we didn't have that, which is why the red circle grew much larger. Does that piece make sense? We okay? Hanging in there with me? All right. So with cortisol and adrenaline, when someone is being traumatized, that faucet gets turned on, huge gush. Keep in mind, cortisol and adrenaline is okay to a certain amount. It helps us focus. It helps us hyper-focus. It helps us kick in and be a little motivator, right? A beautiful mixture, by the way, is adrenaline, cortisol, and dopamine when it's carefully delivered in the system, because that helps you run faster in a race. That helps you swim harder. That helps you focus more on a task. But during the times of trauma, picture the faucet has been knocked all the way on. And so now you're getting this flood of cortisol and adrenaline. And I'm probably going to age myself, but does everyone remember Pac-Man? Remember Pac-Man? Okay, so cortisol and adrenaline, here they come, and all the dots you eat, That's your oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. Cortisol and adrenaline dissipate the levels of oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin. So you see the contradictory relationship these different neurotransmitters have, and so it dissipates. This will stop when we can get Pac-Man to settle down, when we can get cortisol and adrenaline levels low again. Then what you'll have is repopulated oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin as time goes on, right? But during the time of trauma, the faucet gets knocked on high, and we have this flood. Now, in the clinical literature, it will describe what the reaction is. So cortisol and adrenaline, the reaction gives us what is called dormant brain, and it has a number of features. So just really quickly, it kicks us into survival mode, right? Remember survival mode, you can't be in survival mode and learning mode at the same time. Those are competitive. There's a slide on here that you can use that shows that. But you can't be in learning mode and survival mode at the same time. What will always take precedence is survival mode. It will trump all the time. So survival mode kicks off learning mode, which is why sometimes our traumatized kids have such a difficulty learning or retaining what they have learned. Anger and rage, and then despair and depression, those are the two mood states that are easily and repetitively visited when someone has dormant brain. So too much cortisol and adrenaline, you visit these mood states quite often. And by the way, the reason is it's linked all the way back to survival mechanism. If you have enough cortisol and adrenaline, it's really letting parts of the brain know, hey, I don't need you because I'm not in the mode of learning, I'm in the mode of surviving. And for anger, it's letting you know, hey, if I can fight, I have a better chance of survival. So that's why anger and rage is visited more often in a child that has been traumatized, because it's related all the way to a biological mechanism. So why is despair and depression visited? Because it is exhausting being angry and rage-filled. And also you start to realize all of the relations that you're pushing away in your anger states. And so that's why traumatized children visit this despair and depression state more readily and more often. But just realize the two mood states that are visited quite easily due to cortisol and adrenaline are all related back to a biological mechanism. I got to throw you into survival state in order to survive what you're going through, right? And then addictions. What we know definitely is that people that have experienced trauma have higher rates of addiction. Kind of a reductionist view of looking at it, and society does this quite often, mostly because we have a hate-love relationship with science. But the reductionist view is this: oh, well, Jen, of course, if someone's been traumatized, they're going to have higher rates of addiction because we know they're just self-medicating, trying to numb themselves from the pain of their trauma. While that may be true, that's only a small amount of the truth. The larger science picture is this: cortisol and adrenaline that got turned on during the time of trauma, flooding the brain, it has damaged the oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin circuitry. Specifically, it has damaged the dopamine pleasure reward pathway. Dopamine comes from the reward pleasure pathway, which is why when I eat a piece of cake, I'm like, oh, I want more of that, because dopamine floods my system, letting me know I need more and I want more. So that system has become fragile. That system has been damaged by the amount of cortisol and adrenaline that's been flooded. So this system, reward pleasure pathway, is more fragile. So therefore, if I've been traumatized as a child, and let's say I walk into my teens and I'm ready to do a little bit of experimenting with drugs or alcohol, right? I am doing it with a damaged, fragile reward pleasure pathway. That's why traumatized people have higher rates of addiction, is because the original trauma damaged the dopamine system. And so now you're going into experimentation, or you're going into drug use or whatnot. You don't have the same privilege and opportunity to experiment with those because you have a damaged, fragile system. And so that's why. So you don't want to always use the reductionist view. You want to know the full science. The last two, so stagnant thought and limited energy flow. What it's talking about is limited energy flow between regions of the brain. So kind of picture the brain here. We have all these different regions, synaptic activity, neurons going back and forth, neurotransmitters relaying messages. So the brain that flows the smoothest is usually the more high functioning brain. All those regions are talking, all those neurotransmitters going from region to region, all those electrical synapses firing, letting messages shoot back and forth. But if cortisol and adrenaline is flooded in the brain, it slows that down, which is why sometimes our traumatized kids in class don't seem to be picking up as well. They often are stuck on some element and it doesn't flow as easily. So for me, teaching this to students, so many times I'll be assigned students who are aware, openly aware, and acknowledging that they have trauma in their history. So this isn't for someone that hasn't acknowledged the trauma. So if I have a group of students that have acknowledged the trauma, one of the ways to engage them and to treat them is to educate how their brain chemistry has changed, right? Because if you don't educate someone, they'll make up stories about why they're not as quick, why they're not as smart, why they get sad, why they get angry, why they react. They'll make up really dark, ugly narratives that are not fact-based. And so one of the things that we do is to kind of educate and clarify. And so it's psychoeducation. So I pull out 2 cookie sheets. I got 1 cookie sheet, I spray it down with Pam, got a box full of Lego people, right? And then the pan is symbolic of our brain. How quickly we make it from one end of the pan to the other is how neurotransmitters and synaptic activity is happening in the brain and how we're communicating. And so the Lego people are the neuromessengers. These are the neurotransmitters transmitting messages all over the brain. And so I'll have kids take it and we'll chuck that Lego person across that cookie sheet, and it's sprayed with Pam, so it's going to be slick, right? So it's smooth sailing from edge to edge, smooth sailing. And then I've got my second pan over here. And my second pan over here, you don't want to do the activity if you're not okay being a little messy. This second pan activity, I got a little bit of syrup. Usually I run it down to the cafeteria. They'll place it in the refrigerator just for a few minutes. I don't freeze it, just make it a little bit thicker. So just a little bit of syrup. You don't have to be all crazy, just a little bit of syrup. That is an example of a brain with cortisol and adrenaline. So we're taking the same neurotransmitters, they're in everybody, and then now we're going to see how quick they can get down the pan. Can you imagine it? Can you picture it? It's not going to go super quick. And so a lot of times I'm psychoeducating these students. You are not dumb. You are not broken. You're not ineffective. Here's what's going on. You have cortisol and adrenaline, and until that dissipates, you're going to have to ask for help. How do we maneuver and navigate through the world knowing we've got cortisol and adrenaline that slows us down with some stagnant thought and limited energy flow? It is about admitting that this trauma, this situation, released a chemical, cortisol and adrenaline, which served its purpose, which was to help us survive. But now we've got the residual, we've got the leftovers, all this stickiness, slowing our neurotransmitters down. So it's not that we're dumb, it's not that we're stupid, it's that we're going to have to figure out how do we maneuver and navigate through life with a little more of this. And by the way, after that, you usually have children that are more open to asking for help. So you see how we have to recreate the ability to healthily take risks, to ask for assistance. And so that's just an example. There are a number of ways that you can do this example. But if you don't teach someone why their thought process is a little slower, if you don't teach someone, why did I learn something on Monday and I could repeat it to you on Tuesday, and then Wednesday I just feel like a doofus looking at you and I can't think of anything. Realize too, that's also the brain's way of saying, hey, we don't want everything that happened in short-term memory to be passed on to long-term memory. Remember, you got your short-term memory and your long-term memory. You have to do things to extrapolate out of short-term memory and put it in long-term memory. But if you've been abused, your system is already telling you, you do not want everything transferred to long-term memory. Right? So we already have a glitch in that system. That results, by the way, in the limited energy flow, is the short-term memory and long-term memory at odds, that entire process. And so that can be super frustrating. In the past, we would call this sometimes stopgap learning, right? Where they could learn something like with little ones, you know, you'd have them learning something on colors or whatnot, and then come Wednesday, they learned on Monday, they repeated back to you on Tuesday, come Wednesday, you know, of course, the day where you're being supervised, and the supervisor teacher comes in, and they can't name one color. But you're like, this willful kid, they named it on Monday, they named it on Tuesday. That's stopgap when it's regarding trauma, right? Because that system glitches out, being able to utilize that which I learned a moment ago. So you have a lot more stopgap. In the past, teachers would see a lot of stopgap learning during summer. That's why we did extended school year for some. We were afraid what they were going to lose and whatnot. But in reality, what we know now is not all of it is just because it hasn't been reviewed. Some of it is because there's cortisol and adrenaline impeding the ability to go back and pick up what I learned on Monday and Tuesday. So sometimes we'll see some of that. So that's our cortisol and adrenaline piece. Just realizing in general, when cortisol floods the brain, it destroys synapses that are connecting. But here's what a lot of people don't know. It also hinders new synapses from being created, right? So you've got the destruction and you got the hindrance. So cortisol is a lot more powerful than people realized. And so it is a neurotoxic introduction into the brain. And then adrenaline. And there's a lot more other damages that cortisol and adrenaline do. I'm just giving you some top pieces here. So here's what we know about adrenaline. When adrenaline is put on the brain, it impacts memory right away. Most of us as teachers, we rely on explicit memory. Explicit memory is actually how we teach. We teach in this learning block style, right? And then a child is able to let it be known they know about it because they can tell a story. They can tell a narrative about what they've learned. They can put it into sequential language, letting us know you know this topic. That's explicit memory. But when adrenaline from trauma has been turned on, explicit memory actually shuts down, which is why many folks cannot tell their trauma story. Many folks can't make sense out of their trauma story at all. There's fragments that are missing. It's equivalent to this. 100-piece puzzle is the trauma, but you're lucky if you got 50 pieces of the puzzle. And so imagine how difficult it is to go through life knowing this was a really rough time period between 7 and 9 or whatnot, or let's go forward for adults. It's a little bit different with adults, but it still affects someone. So someone going through a traumatic experience as an adult, it's a 100-piece puzzle. But you're now walking out of Afghanistan, you're walking out of there, and you only got 50 pieces of the puzzle. Do you see how angry you would be all the time? How angry you would be because you can't put the puzzle together. You can't make sense. And the same happens for our students, right? Our students, a 100-piece puzzle, but during times of trauma, adrenaline turns on, and it shuts down your ability to capture all 100 pieces of the puzzle. You're lucky if you walk away with 50 of the puzzle pieces, which is why you also enter the stage of anger quite easily. Right? Trying to make sense out of things. For traumatized kids, trying to figure out who was there, who knew, who was involved. For adults that have been through something, who was there, who knew, why did it go south? Why did it go this way? And so again, and if you want to know how frustrating that is, a lot of times in groups, I'll bring out a puzzle. It's going to have 100 pieces. And I have strategically hidden 50 of the puzzle pieces in my desk. And so we're going to put it together, and on top of it, what I have done is torn off the top of the box. So we don't know the picture. That's putting trauma together, trying to make sense of what went down, because cortisol and adrenaline has decoded how we memorize things, how we remember things. And so implicit memory leaves us with these trauma capsules, right? These undigested memory pieces. And they're often related to the senses, right? What we see, what we smell, what we feel, whatnot. So that's implicit memory. So just keep in mind when trauma happens, implicit memory happens. And it lays down in 4 ways. I'll walk you through the 4 ways. Implicit memory can be triggered, right? But it doesn't require a trigger. And that's really important for schools to know, because many times schools will see some type of behavior happening. They know that there's historical trauma. They know that's little Johnny, and they know during the ages of 4 to 6 he was horrifically traumatized. So they know that, right? And so now what they're doing is trying to figure out, when we see his outlandish behavior, when we see him flip a table, flip a desk, a lot of times we're all looking for the trauma, the trigger, what set him off. But remember, implicit memory does not require a trigger. It can be triggered, but it doesn't require a trigger. And so now what you're all doing is doing a futile expedition looking for a needle in a haystack, where there isn't a needle, but there also is not a haystack. So just keep in mind, it does not have to be triggered. Implicit memory can simply bleed all over you at any given time. So here we go, the first one, perceptual memory. Perceptual memory is just how you perceive the elements that were related to your trauma. So the picture is just letting you know, hey, if you were bit by a mouse, let's go with a dog instead. A dog's a little easier to picture. If you're bit by a dog, right, and that brings about all the cortisol and adrenaline, it has an element of trauma and terror to it, right? Perceptual memory, how I'm going to lay it down in my implicit memory, is I'm now going to perceive all dogs, no matter how cute, how fluffy, no matter how little. It could be little enough, you know, they're like, I don't know, a large caterpillar, whatnot, but you still perceive them as this thing that could be so traumatizing. You still perceive them. Now, everyone realizes we're not talking about dogs here, but I don't want to put a picture up of humans. But for kids that have been traumatized, it really is how they perceive humans. You caused this amount of harm here, but now I'm supposed to go back into the school setting where there's all kinds of humans. I'm supposed to walk into the cafeteria where you have all the adults working. I'm supposed to walk into a schoolroom where you have adults. Those are all potential offenders. And so if perceptual memory is laid down that I was harmed by humans, then I'm going to be fearful of humans. And what we know is that most children have been harmed by adults. So now we have even a more sophisticated perceptual memory. The sophisticated perceptual memory is, I'm fearful of adults, right? So that's perceptual memory. Does not need to be triggered. Can be evoked and felt at any time. So that's one way of implicit memory laying down. Emotional memory. This is really active in the limbic system. So what we know is that during the times of trauma, whatever type of trauma it is, right, it will evoke a number of emotions. Fear, terror, you can think of all of them. Shame, disappointment by who's hurting you, right? So all of these emotions, well, they go into a gunny sack in the limbic system. And now you have to maneuver and navigate through life. This doesn't go away after the trauma is done. Right? The same way the perception of the dog doesn't go away after the dog bite. The original dog bite happened years ago, but your perception of how dangerous dogs are continues. Well, the same for the emotional memory. Now you have this gunny sack in your limbic system. It does not have to be triggered. You can be sitting in class learning about dinosaurs, loving every minute of it. And before you know it, the gunny sack has opened up. And those emotions from that terror day, from that trauma day, have come flooding over. And so now you have someone sitting in class, second grade, learning about dinosaurs, but in their mind, in their body, they are in a state of panic, fear, terror, shame, all the emotions that were plumbed in there, all the emotions that were put into that gunny sack, they're just unraveling. And remember, that becomes too much for a little nervous system to take. And so they have to create some type of distraction. What's the easiest way of creating a distraction? Create some brouhaha, right? So this is someone that's going to knock the dinosaur model off the table, or this is someone that's going to turn to a kid and get them activated, punch them, get them involved or whatnot. And so they're looking for a way to interrupt the spillage of the gunny sack in the limbic system. So it doesn't have to be activated, it can simply come over them. So that's your emotional memory. The third way implicit memory is laid down, remember there's only 4 ways. The third way is procedural memory. So procedural memory has cognition about what your body is and how it reacts or how it didn't react. So procedural memory doesn't happen to all traumatized individuals. This is a combo pick, by the way. Out of four, you might really struggle with perceptual memory or bodily sensation memory, or you might really struggle with 3 out of the 2. So it's a combo pick. Procedural memory is one of the hardest ones for us to study because it is the awareness that your body did not react in the way that you wanted it to during the time of trauma. So all of us, let me put it also in this way. Anytime you have an upset at work with someone, right, you just have a little upset. It's not traumatic, just a little upset. You know, your principal said something or whatnot, and then you go home. How many of you do this? Oh, if I would have only said this, or oh, if I said this, right? You start to reimagine how you would handle it and how you wish you would handle it. That's related to procedural memory. And so you get a little bit of frustrated that you didn't say anything. You didn't say anything at all. You didn't respond. You didn't react. You just, and left, right? So that is in us as a human species. We want to be able to look back at situations and go, yeah, I reacted the way I needed to. I handled myself the way I needed to. Procedural memory is many times the reality for traumatized individuals, that if I would have only fought harder, or if my legs would have run faster, or if I could have brought my hands up to protect, or I could have used my feet to kick someone off, or if I could have used my voice. Why didn't I scream? My voice was here, my scream was here. Why did it never come out? So procedural memory is this leftover feeling that your body has betrayed you and you do not know if it will betray you again. So imagine a 7th grader in class. They're learning something, they're engaged in class, they're loving it, they're there, they're 100% there, but all of a sudden this awareness that if something were to go horribly awry in this room, I do not know how my body would step in. I do not know how my body would protect me. I do not know if my body would be there. And so now, are they listening to you in class? No. Are they learning what's being taught? No. Do they look distracted? Yes, because they're actually fighting a war behind the eyes. They're somewhere else. This procedural memory with this leftover realization that sometimes my body will act and sometimes my body will inact, will not have the action that I'm hoping for or wanting. And so that pulls someone away. So again, in 7th grade, they only got half of the lesson that was being taught in that particular class. So they're not going to do so well academically. And then our last one, bodily sensation memory. This was really studied in depth with van der Kolk's book, Body Keeps the Score. This was the original cover for van der Kolk book, Body Keeps the Score. I will give you an activator warning ahead of time. It's very difficult to read. It does talk in depth about different traumas and whatnot, but it's still the most robust book that we use to teach people about the effects of trauma. And so in this book, it has about 7 chapters just dedicated to this. The body will remember where it was harmed, right? And so remember, it's an implicit style of memory. It's one of the implicit styles of memory. And so that means that this child sitting in 2nd grade, trying to focus on what you're all talking about and trying to learn or whatnot, can sometimes have radiating pain in the areas of the body where they were hurt or harmed. And so you can see where that would be different for everyone, right? And so now what we have is the body, for no reason at all, is screaming out in pain. And so this child cannot pay attention, will often, if they're an older child, they will breadcrumb think it all the way back and go, am I going crazy? Because look, everyone else is handling everything fine. What's happening here? And so it's when the pieces of the body that were actually harmed and hurt in different ways is demanding attention. The cell memory has come open. The cell memory is alert and remembering the pain that was directed upon it at their time of trauma. So those are the 4 implicit ways. Here's the only reason why we point this out. If you have a kid in class that has historical trauma, they're acting out behaviors, you have to remind yourself consistently, it's not because she did anything, right? Well, let me take that back. There are some teachers out there that are awful that should have just worked at Lowe's or Home Depot. Like that goes for every scope. I could say the same for psychotherapists, right? But here's what we know, the majority of the time, the behavior that gets exploded out has nothing to do with what you're talking about in class, has nothing to do with you just handed back a paper and it was a D, has nothing to do with you asking someone to change sheets, has nothing to do with this or that. We have to remind ourselves that sometimes this explosive style behavior is because implicit memory came out to visit. Does not have to be triggered. You don't have to look around and figure out, does anyone look like the perpetrator? Does anyone smell like the perpetrator? There might be that. But remember, implicit memory does not have to be triggered or activated. And so we have to remind ourselves that sometimes the explosive behaviors that we see are not in direct correlation to what is being done in the classroom, to what is being done in the school. The reason why that is so important is because the research lets us know that when teachers have explosive behavior, they will take up to 72 hours combing through their own memory, beating themselves up. How do I engage with this kid? How can I do this different? In some ways, that's awesome. That shows the loving profession that we are involved in. However, 72 hours beating yourself up, looking for a needle in a haystack, where once again, there might not be a needle and might not be a haystack. So what we have to do is train our teachers, breathe. We all are aware that Tommy has had some historical trauma. We're going to figure out how to connect with him, but stop linking it all the way back to you. Now, on some occasion, could it be you? Yeah, because some of you should have never gotten in the field in the first place. Yes. But what we know the majority of the time, the people that stay in the field are the ones that step in, the ones that are trying to engage, the ones that are trying to change things. But 72 hours, you have lost 3 days of your personal life trying to figure out, how can I do it different with Tommy? Looking at how you did something wrong. We've got to slow that down, or else what we're going to have is continued mass exodus from teachers, right? So let teachers know the majority of you step in, right? It's not that you create the harm, it's that you are trying to address it. Okay, so what can we do? One of the things that we can do is we have to stop using certain phrases. So this phrase is still used in schools, and we've really got to eradicate it, right? What doesn't kill you can, what? Make you stronger. We have to pull back on this phrase. I know it's hard for a lot of people because it has a religious or a faith-based connection. However, it has a tendency to romanticize trauma. So what doesn't kill you, actually, here's what it can do. It can dysregulate your nervous system. What doesn't kill you can trap itself in your body. What doesn't kill you can steal your sense of self. What doesn't kill you can make you wish it did. So we've got to move on over here. Stop glorifying trauma. We've got to pull back on that. So that's one thing we do, is just change our language. Because really what it does is it leaves that student there to go, hey, what are the golden nuggets that I should be learning from my trauma? So we want to be able to stop that piece. Now, current classroom experience. So the first part was just a little bit of the neuroscience related to trauma, but I'm going to tie it into what has happened post shutdown, right? So we're going to see how this relates. So tell me, if any, just shake your hand or whatnot if any of this makes sense. Current classroom experience. These kids are different. They are not like the kids from before. I've been teaching 4th grade for 13 years, Jen. And these are not 4th graders. They are not the same. They are more like 2nd graders. How about this one? Whoa, these 1st graders are feral. Anybody hear any of that? Right now, what we have is the word feral has been used in the clinical literature more times in the last 3 years than it ever has prior, right? So, and it's always in description of kindergartens and 1st graders now, post shutdown. How about this one? I'm getting ready to retire after teaching senior English for some 20 years. And I know these kids are not the same. My current seniors act more like freshmen. And then these are just the terms that have been identified in the literature, used over and over for our current classroom experiences. See more rude behavior, more immature behavior, more disrespectful behavior, more disinterested behavior, and no attention span within the classroom. Does any of that sound familiar? Okay, so there is a difference, and no one's going to like it, but there very much is a difference. It can't all be blamed on COVID for sure, because we already had trajectory of anxiety and depression absolutely through the roof. Generation Z, these would be our older kids right now in high school, and then some post-high school kids going into college. They had been exposed to a number of things that put them in the tolerable stress and in the toxic stress order, right? So they were exposed to social media, they exposed to shootings and whatnot, and so again, changing the way that their brain really functions by dissipating some of the oxytocin, dopamine, and serotonin that are typically there. Why? Increasing the cortisol and adrenaline. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the generations because I just want to get you to the post-COVID stats. So Generation Alpha, these are our current kids, right? So anyone born 2010, these are our current kids, children that are 14 and under. And this generation is getting a lot of slack, man, a lot of hardship, especially because they're so tech savvy. This is the only generation that was born on screens, meaning screens were already up and running at the time of their birth. So screens are not going to go anywhere. It's that we have to teach how to use screens. What's interesting enough, this generation really gets trashed a lot with their technology use, but here's what's coming out in the research. This is actually going to be our most empathetic generation ever. ever. And we are identifying from social science research, we're identifying that empathy comes from, they have seen brutality done not only in North America on the screen, but globally. They're very aware of some of the hate crimes, some of the hurt that people can do to others. So this is actually going to map out, they are becoming one of the most empathetic. However, when you're an empathetic person and you're sitting at a table, because hypothetically you're sitting at a table with people that are not so kind, your empathy will only take you so far. Eventually you're going to get angry. So this is not only going to be the most empathetic generation, but it'll be the most angry. And they're already angry. They're angry at the generation prior to them. Right? And so kind of keep in mind this generation alpha, just some general stats about them and whatnot. But it actually is turning out highest empathy scores than we've ever seen in the generations. And again, we believe it's due to them being exposed to some of the things on the phone or their screen time. And we do need to change that. We need to figure out how to do that. So in my district, I do a huge training just on algorithms. How do we change the algorithms? How do we change your algorithms? You're in charge of cultivating your algorithm. So how does it nurture and nourish you? And so kind of having that. And a lot of times, we bribe kids. Let me have your phone and change your algorithm. It'll take me 2 minutes. I'll change your algorithm, right? And so really teaching people how to get in there and do that. But yes, indeed, these kids are different. Just in general, and again, I'm not going to go through all these, but these are just the shooting sprees from 2012, and only some of them. So that Generation Z and that Generation Alpha were plagued with all of these mass shootings. This is where the anger comes from, the anger towards others for not being able to intervene and stop some of this. But here are some of the cognitive messages that are being left behind with this generation. Look at these last 4. Look at that. In 2022, 46% of California college graduates had student loan debt that they were unsure if they would ever be able to pay off. 2020. So that means your Generation Z and Generation Alpha is at the dinner table, and they're aware of that. They're hearing, because that's older brother and sister, that's auntie and uncle, that's sometimes very young parents. So they are aware. Like, why are we hanging this carrot saying, don't you want education? The way they're interpreting is, don't you want debt? So we have lost the golden carrot that was education. A lot of times it's not panning out, and they're aware of it because they're at these dinner tables. They are hearing it. They're hearing this conversation in the home. Look down here. As of 2022, 54% of Americans believe they will never own a home. Never own a home. Once again, Generation Z and Generation Alpha, they are hearing these conversations. So in the past, we used to talk about school like this. You go to school, you do well. You go to college, you do well, you get a job, and then you buy what? A home. So once again, Generation Z and Generation Alpha are wondering why you're all lying. Because it didn't work out for you. So this is where the anger comes from. You want me to go to school that I'll never be able to pay off. You want me also I'm never going to have a home. And so we can no longer use academia as this beautiful pathway to a savings, financial freedom, and a home. And so they're smart. They're online. They're hearing that that's not the case. They're at your dinner tables. They're at your breakfast tables. They're in your homes, and they're hearing it. And so now they have to come to school every day and wonder why you're lying the big lie. Do you see that generation? That's where the generational difference is, right? They're wondering, where's the empathy towards me, since many of these things are going. And then let's look at the last 2. 2022. Only 2 in 10 Americans say they trust the government in Washington to do what's right. Wow. And then look at that. Just about always 2%, right? Only 2% believe the government's going to do what's right always. Most of the time, only 19% of Americans believe the government's going to do what's right. That's huge. So once again, Generation Z and Generation Alpha are aware that it's being raised in a country where they're not even sure, are you looking out for me? Because I'm hearing at the dinner table, government's not even looking out for you, mom. Government's not even looking out for you, auntie. Government's not even looking out for older brother, right? And then look at the very last one. Currently, over half Americans feel unsafe on a daily basis. So once again, with Generation Z and Generation Alpha, these are the cognitions. These are the thinking patterns that are embedded in them. And hence, this is where the anger comes from. And so when we step in and we say, hey, can you put your phone down? They're like, you don't have the right to ask me anything. Nothing. I can't even get a home. right? Can't even pay off my loan. So realize this anger is very much a generational anger. And we are seeing it play out. Lots of research dedicated in this area. Like I said, not all of it is COVID's fault. So we can't blame COVID, can't blame the pandemic. Look at that. In the 10 years leading up to the pandemic, feelings of persistent sadness and hopelessness, as well as suicidal thoughts and behaviors, increased by 40% among young people. 40%. So on the trajectory of suicidal thinking, anxiety, and depression, if you were to look on a graph, we were climbing. Then COVID happened. We simply hit the pause button. Now that we're out of COVID, 2023, it was recognized no longer a global emergency. Now here we are back on the same trajectory that we were on before COVID. It was only a pause. It did not repair things, it did not reset things. It was simply a pause. The trajectory, we were back on the same trajectory. This was a 2019, just a review of high schoolers. Those stats are just outrageous in North American of suicidal thinking in high school, right? So 19% seriously considering attempting suicide. 3% actually made a suicide attempt, right? There had to be some type of intrusion to keep that suicide attempt from moving forward. Those are huge numbers. That was 2019 before pandemic. So we can't blame things on the pandemic. Again, and just another stat, anxiety and depression, those disorders increasing by 63% from 2005 to 2017, 63%, right? So again, before the pandemic, we were on this trajectory. All the pandemic did was a pause. We are back on the same trajectory as we speak now. If you wanted to read more just about that, I put this in there, Generation Z by Tim Elmore, a phenomenal book. Also teaches us how to start talking to our adolescents and our adults, young adults in our lives about phone use, right? Just having this conversation. North Americans, we don't know how to moderate. We've never known how to moderate. Moderation is our issue. So learning how to use our phone in a more healthier way, because the technology is not going away. We have to learn how to utilize it. And Generation Z gives you a lot of insight on how you speak to this anxious population. But here's what we know. In regards to your kids looking different in classrooms, we know that to be true because the research is in. There's been cortical thinning, right? This has been proven over and over in lots of research. The brains of adolescents who were assessed after the pandemic shutdowns, and it appeared several years older than those of teens who were assessed before the pandemic. Until now, such accelerated changes in brain age have only been seen in kids who have been traumatized. So you see how we're coming full loop? The conversation is about trauma. So here's what we know. If this kid is raised in a traumatizing home, we measure his cortex, we measure the cortical, we will see thinning of this brain compared to this child who was not raised in a traumatized home. We will see a thicker cortex. Trauma, thinner cortex. So here we go. COVID and the shutdown turned on cortisol and adrenaline. So now what we have is kids coming out of the shutdown. We are actually seeing this thinning cortex. By the way, the only time you see thinning cortex is when we're talking about neurocognitive disorders that happen later in life, Alzheimer's, dementia, we see thinning cortex. Or the only other time we see thinning cortex is if you come from an abusive, traumatizing home. And now what we have is the majority of adolescents have a thinner cortex. What does that look like? 3 years regression. That's why you can look at a senior and they're really acting like a sophomore or a freshman. That's why you can look at a first grader and they're really acting like a feral cat, right? So 3 years on average is the immaturity regression, 3 years on average. And so now at this time, everyone should go, oh my God, what do? We have cortical thinning and whatnot. Cortical thinning has been researched forever. We researched it, social services researched it because we wanted to know how to help traumatized kids. Research after research after research, study after study after study has said, teach mindfulness. It's not just for SEL. It's not just for funsies. Teach mindfulness. That's how you thicken the cortex. We have researched this all the way from the beginning when you can do fMRIs. We measured what happens to the cortex when you teach them mindfulness practices, and guess what? They thicken. So we have to ask ourselves, why are we not having more mindfulness classes taught in school? Why is it not an expectation, especially since we know with the research, the majority of them have thinning cortex, right? We already know the behavioral patterns, 3 years regression of maturity and whatnot. So thicken the cortex, roll out some mindfulness. All right, went through that super quick.
Thank you.
Thank you.